I remember the taste of blood in my mouth when I chose to kill my brother. Not my blood brother. Those bonds were severed the day the chaplains came. I mean my battle brother, Marius. The Marine who had fought beside me for 37 years across 17 worlds. The warrior who had dragged my broken body from the crater on Vauxhall Prime when the Orc shells found their mark. The only being in the galaxy who knew that sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I still dreamed of my mother's face. I killed him because the Codex demanded it, because duty required it, because that is what it means to be a Space Marine. My name is Brother-Sergeant Cassius Dorn, and I am nothing more than a weapon in the Emperor's arsenal, one of a million transhuman killers scattered across the galaxy's bleeding edge. For 123 years, I have served the Imperium of man. I have witnessed the birth of stars and the death of species. I have walked through the ashes of civilizations and planted the Aquila's banner in soil made fertile by genocide. You think this makes me a hero? The propaganda tells you we are angels. The Imperial Creed preaches that we are humanity's salvation made manifest. But let me tell you what they don't want you to know. What it truly costs to become one of the Emperor's chosen. This is my confession, my warning, my testament to the price of transcendence. Chapter 1. The Harvest. The selection began before I was born. On the forge world of Metalica, where the air tastes of copper and machine oil, where the sun never penetrates the eternal smog of industrial output, demographic analysts tracked genetic markers across 10,000 family lines. They measured skull density, bone structure, muscle fiber composition. They noted psychological profiles, aggression indices, loyalty quotients. My parents never knew they were being evaluated. Worker Unit 7743 Gamma and Manufactorum. Supervisor 2156 Delta thought they were living their own lives, making their own choices. They didn't understand that their courtship, their mating, their reproduction, all of it had been guided by forces beyond their comprehension. I was born at 0347 hours on the 14th day of Tertius. Weight 4.2 kilograms. Length 54 centimeters. The bioreaders showed optimal growth patterns, enhanced reflexes, and a neurological structure that marked me as exceptional among the worker classes. The apothecaries came for me when I turned 10. I remember that morning with perfect clarity. An unwanted gift of the eidetic memory implants. The klaxons of shift change echoing through the hab blocks. The bitter taste of recaf substitute and protein paste on my tongue. My mother's tears mixing with the oil-stained rainwater that perpetually dripped from Metalica's sky. "He is chosen," the apothecary said, his voice a mechanical rasp through his rebreather. Behind him stood two Marines in the blue and white of the Aurora chapter. Their massive forms filled our hab unit's doorway, their presence making the cramped space feel even smaller. My father dropped to his knees, not from grief, from overwhelming joy. To have a child selected for the Adeptus Astartes was the highest honor a worker family could achieve. Their genetic line would be remembered. Their names would be entered in the chapter's rolls. I felt nothing. At 10 years old, I already understood that emotion was a luxury the weak indulged in. They gave my parents 30 minutes to say goodbye. 30 minutes to compress a lifetime of love and hope and desperate farewell into words that could never be adequate. I spent those minutes studying my new masters, analyzing their equipment, memorizing the chapter symbols on their pauldrons. Even then, I was already beginning the transformation. Chapter 2. The Fortress Monastery. Aspiration's end rises from the blasted moonscape of Demios like a monument to humanity's capacity for violence. 30 kilometers of adamantine and ceramite, its spires reaching toward a sky that burns perpetually red from the radiation storms that scour this cursed world. The shuttle that carried us, myself and 47 other boys stolen from across the sector, shuddered as it passed through the monastery's void shields. Through the viewport, I could see training grounds where Space Marines conducted live fire exercises, their bolter rounds lighting up the darkness like deadly stars. Welcome to hell. whispered the boy beside me. His name was Joachim, I would later learn. He had been taken from the death world of Korin, where he'd survived for 12 years in jungles populated by creatures that could strip flesh from bone in seconds. He wouldn't survive his first week on Demios. The sergeant who greeted us wore the skull helm of a chaplain, his armor black as the void between stars. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of absolute truth. "You are no longer human," he declared as we stood shivering in the landing bay's frigid air. "You are aspirants, raw material. Some of you will be forged into angels of death. Most of you will die in the attempt. All of you will be changed." The statistics were brutal in their simplicity. Of the 48 boys in our group, perhaps 4 or 5 would survive to receive their first implant. Of those, maybe 2 would live to see their black carapace installed. 1, if we were fortunate, would become a full battle brother. The rest would feed the servitors or fertilize the training ground's barren soil. They gave us 12 hours to sleep, eat, and contemplate our fate. The dormitory was a vast hall lined with simple cots, each marked with a number rather than a name. I was aspirant 7743 Gamma Prime, my identity reduced to the same designation system that had catalogued my parents on Metalica. I lay awake that first night, listening to the other boys weep for their lost families. Some prayed to the Emperor, begging for strength or deliverance. Others simply stared at the ceiling, their young minds already beginning to fracture under the weight of what they'd been chosen for. I calculated probabilities instead. 48 aspirants. Historical success rates suggested 4.2% would achieve full Astartes status. That meant roughly 2 of us would survive. I studied my competition in the darkness, evaluating physical builds, psychological resilience, adaptability markers. By dawn, I had identified the 11 most likely candidates for elimination in the first round of trials. I was correct about 10 of them. Chapter 3. Trial by Ordeal. The trials began with the crucible of flesh. We were marched naked into a chamber deep beneath the fortress monastery, where the air hung thick with chemical vapors, and the screams of previous aspirants still seemed to echo from the walls. Medical servitors, shambling hybrids of man and machine, prepared instruments of surgical precision. "Pain is weakness leaving the body," intoned Chaplain Mordaunt as the first boy was strapped to an examination table. "Today, we will discover how much weakness you carry." What followed was 6 hours of systematic torture masquerading as medical evaluation. Every nerve ending was tested, every pain threshold measured. Needles probed muscle fibers, electrodes mapped neural responses. Chemicals flooded our bloodstreams to gauge our body's reactions to toxins we might encounter on 100 different worlds. Joachim broke during the second hour. The pain engines detected the moment his mind snapped, when his screams transformed from expressions of agony into something more primal. The servitors noted his failure with mechanical precision, and he was taken away. I never saw him again. By the trial's end, 31 aspirants remained. The weak had been culled with ruthless efficiency, their breaking points catalogued for future reference. Those of us who endured were given a single meal nutrient paste that tasted of nothing and everything before the next ordeal began. The test of blades came at dawn. They armed us with simple combat knives and divided us into pairs. The rules were elegant in their simplicity. Fight until one of you cannot continue. Victory meant advancement. Defeat meant death. My opponent was a boy named Tarkus from the hive world of Necromunda. He was larger than me, older, with the scarred hands of someone who'd killed before. He looked at me with the confidence of a predator sizing up easy prey. I opened his throat with the first cut. It wasn't skill that saved me. Not yet. It was the absence of hesitation. While Tarkus was still processing the reality of what we'd been asked to do, I had already committed to murder. His blood painted my face as he fell, and I felt nothing but satisfaction at a problem efficiently solved. 16 aspirants remained. The trials continued for 3 months. Tests of endurance where we ran until our feet bled and our lungs burned. Psychological evaluations that probed for weakness, doubt, or excessive empathy. Combat scenarios against servitors programmed to kill without mercy. Each trial claimed more lives. Each failure was noted, studied, and filed away to improve future selection processes. By the end, 4 of us remained. 4 boys who had proven themselves capable of becoming something more and less than human. Chapter 4: The First Implant. The transformation began with the secondary heart. They strapped me to an operating table in the depths of the apothecarium, where the air hummed with the energy of life support machines and the walls were lined with organs growing in nutrient baths. Chief Apothecary Valerius stood over me, his augmetic eyes whirring as they focused on my chest. "This will hurt," he said, not unkindly. "Pain is part of the process. It teaches your body that weakness is unacceptable." The scalpel parted flesh with surgical precision. I watched in the reflection of his visor as he opened my ribcage, exposing the beating rhythm of my primary heart. The secondary organ, grown from gene seed harvested from fallen battle brothers, was pale and quivering, like some alien parasite waiting to be implanted. The pain was indescribable. I had thought the trials had prepared me for suffering, but this was different. This was violation at the cellular level, my body's fundamental architecture being rewritten by foreign tissue. The secondary heart nestled against my primary, its rhythm gradually synchronizing until both beat as one. Recovery took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of fever dreams, where I saw visions of ancient warriors, their memories encoded in the gene seed, now growing within me. I witnessed the siege of terror through the eyes of a battle brother who had stood upon the walls. I felt the cold of space as another Marine conducted boarding actions against traitor vessels. The memories weren't mine, but they became part of me nonetheless. When the fever broke, I was changed. My cardiovascular system had been enhanced, my blood now carrying oxygen more efficiently than any baseline human could achieve. I could run for hours without fatigue, fight in environments that would kill ordinary men. I was no longer entirely human, but I was not yet Astartes. The second implant came 3 months later. The os modula, a small organ implanted at the base of my skull, began the process of reinforcing my skeleton with ceramic-like deposits. My bones grew denser, harder, capable of withstanding impacts that would shatter normal human frames. The pain was constant now, a grinding ache as my body rebuilt itself from the inside out. I could feel my skull thickening, my ribcage expanding, my spine lengthening. I grew taller, broader, my proportions shifting beyond the bounds of natural human variation. The other aspirants were changing too. Vex, who had been taken from a feudal world where he'd served as a knight's squire, developed muscles like armor plating. His voice deepened into something that could be heard over battlefield din. Corvin, a former gang leader from the underhive of Armageddon, gained reflexes that made him seem to move in slow motion compared to baseline humans. But it was Matthias who changed most dramatically. The Laraman's organ, designed to rapidly clot blood and seal wounds, integrated with his system so completely that his skin took on an almost translucent quality. We could see his enhanced circulatory system through his flesh, the modified blood flowing in patterns that spelled out the chapter's battle honors in living script. He was beautiful and terrible, a living illustration of what we were all becoming. The implantation process continued for 2 years, 19 organs in total, each one reshaping us further from our human origins. The Becher's gland gave us the ability to spit corrosive acid. The multi-lung allowed us to breathe poisonous atmospheres or survive in vacuum for limited periods. The ulitic kidney filtered toxins that would kill normal humans. Each addition came with its own agonies, its own period of adaptation. My body rejected the preomnal stomach 3 times before finally accepting it. Vex died during the implantation of the neuroglottis, his brain unable to cope with the enhanced neural pathways. By the end, only Corvin and I remained. We were no longer the children who had been taken from our families. We stood nearly 8 feet tall, our frames bulked with enhanced musculature. Our senses could detect minute changes in air pressure, electromagnetic fields, chemical traces invisible to baseline human perception. We could survive wounds that would be instantly fatal to others. fight in environments across the spectrum of hostile conditions. We were weapons given flesh, angels carved from pain and gene craft. But the true transformation was still to come. Chapter 5. The Black Carapace. The final implant was also the most dangerous. The Black Carapace, a web of neural interfaces that would allow us to bond with power armor, required complete mapping of our nervous systems. The apothecaries spent weeks preparing us, injecting tracer compounds that would highlight every nerve pathway, every neural junction. Many aspirants died during this procedure, Chief Apothecary Valerius informed us as we prepared for surgery. The carapace must integrate with your spinal column, your brainstem, your peripheral nervous system. One error, one rejection, and you will spend eternity as a servitor. I had seen the failed aspirants in the monastery's deeper levels, lobotomized hulks that had once been candidates for the Adeptus Astartes, now reduced to mindless drones that swept floors and maintained equipment. Their empty eyes followed us as we passed, perhaps retaining some fragment of awareness trapped within their butchered minds. The surgery took 18 hours. I remained conscious throughout, as was traditional. The pain suppressors kept me lucid, but did nothing to dull the agony as the carapace integrated with my nervous system. I felt every connection forming, every neural pathway being rewired to accommodate the interface ports that would eventually link me to power armor's machine spirit. Corvin's surgery had begun 6 hours before mine. I could hear his screams echoing through the apothecarian's corridors, a sound that gradually faded into mechanical breathing as the carapace took hold. When I finally saw him again, he was changed beyond recognition. The black carapace showed beneath his skin like a secondary skeleton, its interface ports creating raised ridges across his torso and limbs. When he moved, I could see the neural connections firing, creating patterns of light beneath his flesh. "How do you feel?" I asked him during our recovery period. He considered the question for a long moment, his enhanced mind processing sensations no baseline human could comprehend. "Complete," he said finally, "as if I've been waiting my entire life to become this." I understood what he meant. The carapace didn't just interface with power armor, it interfaced with us, becoming as much a part of our bodies as our enhanced hearts or reinforced bones. We could feel its presence even when unarmored, a potential for connection that made us truly transhuman. 3 weeks later, we donned our first suits of power armor. The sensation was indescribable. The armor's machine spirit merged with my consciousness, its systems becoming extensions of my enhanced senses. I could feel the servo motors responding to my thoughts, the targeting systems linking to my optic nerves, the power plant's rhythms synchronizing with my dual hearts. I was no longer merely wearing the armor, I had become one with it. Brother Captain Thaddeus was there to witness our first steps as fully fledged space marines. His own armor was a masterwork of artifice, its surfaces inscribed with honor marks dating back to the Great Crusade. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of centuries. "You are space marines now," he declared. "The Emperor's angels of death. You have transcended humanity to become something greater. Weapons in service of the Golden Throne, guardians of mankind's future." He paused, his helm turning to regard each of us in turn. "But remember this, transcendence comes with a price. You are no longer men. You are no longer capable of the simple pleasures that define human existence. You will know no family save your battle brothers, no love save duty, no peace save death." I felt no sadness at these words. The emotions he described belonged to the child I had once been. Before the trials, before the implants, before the transformation had burned away everything weak and merely human. I felt only purpose, only the cold satisfaction of a weapon finally understanding its function. Chapter 6. First Blood. Our first deployment came 6 months after our elevation to full battle brother status. The world of Garax Prime had fallen silent, its astropathic communications ceasing mid-transmission during what should have been a routine tithe assessment. Imperial protocol demanded investigation. Worlds that went dark were often harboring rebellion, heresy, or worse. Our strike cruiser, the Righteous Fury, translated into the Garax system after 3 weeks in the warp. Long-range Auspex immediately detected anomalies on the primary world surface massive energy signatures that didn't match any known Imperial technology. "Xenos!" growled Sergeant Voss as we studied the tactical displays. "Energy patterns suggest Eldar involvement, possibly Drukhari raiding parties." I had studied the Eldar during my training, learning their capabilities, their weaknesses, their typical tactical patterns. They were ancient, decadent, technologically superior to humanity in most respects. They were also arrogant, which made them vulnerable to direct assault by properly motivated Space Marines. Our mission parameters were simple: investigate the silence, eliminate hostile forces, restore Imperial authority. 48 hours later, I was standing in a drop pod, my bolter mag-locked to my thigh as atmospheric entry began. The drop pod's machine spirit sang hymns of war as we plummeted toward Garax Prime's surface. Around me, my battle brothers maintained the ritual silence of approaching combat. Brother Alexios checked his Chainsword's teeth one final time. Brother Valen verified his flamer's fuel reserves. Each of us performed the small ceremonies that prepared mind and spirit for the violence to come. Impact came with bone-jarring force, the pod's retro rockets firing at the last moment to prevent lethal deceleration. The assault ramp exploded outward, and we emerged into hell. Garax Prime's capital city was a charnel house. Bodies lay scattered in the streets, their flesh flayed from their bones with surgical precision. Buildings had been partially demolished, their structures twisted into artistic arrangements that spoke of alien aesthetics. The air reeked of blood and something else, a metallic tang that made my enhanced olfactory systems recoil in disgust. "Drukhari," confirmed Brother-Sergeant Marcus through the Vox. "Classic raiding pattern. They're harvesting souls for their entertainment." We advanced through the city streets in perfect formation, our enhanced senses scanning for threats. The silence was unnatural. No survivors, no scavengers, not even the buzz of flies around the corpses. Whatever the Drukhari had done here, they had been thorough. The first contact came at the central plaza. They emerged from hidden portals, their forms wreathed in shadows and crackling energy. Drukhari warriors in spiked armor, their weapons designed to cause maximum agony rather than clean death. Behind them came something worse, a Talos pain engine, its mechanical limbs adorned with flensing tools and torture devices. "For the Emperor!" roared Sergeant Marcus, his bolt pistol barking death. The battle that followed was my introduction to the reality of war. My training had prepared me for combat, but nothing could have prepared me for the sensory overload of actual battle. The deafening crack of bolter fire, the screams of dying Xenos, the smell of cordite and burning flesh. My enhanced reflexes allowed me to track multiple targets simultaneously, but the sheer chaos was overwhelming. I killed my first enemy, a Drukhari warrior who tried to flank our position. With a burst from my bolter, the mass-reactive rounds detonated inside his torso, painting the wall behind him with Xeno's viscera. I felt nothing but satisfaction at a threat eliminated. The Talos was more challenging. Its armor deflected our bolt rounds, forcing us to concentrate fire on its joints and sensor arrays. It retaliated with weapons designed to capture rather than kill, seeking to harvest us for its master's entertainment. One of its tendrils wrapped around Brother Alexios, the neural shredders at its tip beginning to flay his nervous system. His screams echoed through the plaza as the device began its work. I could have tried to save him. My training included rescue protocols for captured battle brothers, but tactical analysis indicated that attempting rescue would compromise the mission and likely result in additional casualties. I put a bolt round through his head instead. It was a mercy killing, ending his suffering and denying the Xenos their sport. As his body went limp in the Talos' grip, I felt the first stirring of what would become a familiar emotion in the decades to come, the cold satisfaction of a difficult decision correctly made. The battle continued for 3 more hours. We cleared the city sector by sector, purging the remaining Drukhari forces with systematic efficiency. By the end, 47 Xenos lay dead, their exotic weapons claimed as trophies. We had lost 2 battle brothers, Alexios to the Talos and Brother Varlan to a splinter weapon that bypassed his armor's protection. Their gene seed was harvested by the apothecary, ensuring their genetic legacy would continue in future generations of Marines. That night, as we stood vigil over our fallen brothers, I realized something fundamental had changed within me. The boy who had wept for his mother on Metalica was gone, consumed by the transformation process. In his place stood something harder, colder, more efficient. I was no longer capable of grief as normal humans understood it. I could acknowledge loss, analyze its tactical implications, file it away for future reference. But the raw emotional pain that had once characterized human suffering was beyond my reach now. I was what I had been designed to be, a weapon that could function regardless of cost, unhindered by doubt or sentiment. Chapter 7. The Weight of Command. 50 years passed before I understood the true price of what I had become. I had risen through the ranks with methodical precision, my enhanced mind processing tactical data with mechanical efficiency. Each campaign taught me new lessons in warfare. Each battle honed my skills to razor sharpness. I had fought orcs on a dozen worlds, cleansed chaos cults from the underhives of 3 systems, and stood against the tyrannid swarms that threatened the Eastern Rim. By the time the Gethsemane rebellion began, I wore the rank insignia of Brother-Sergeant and commanded a tactical squad of 10 Marines. Gethsemane was an agri-world, one of thousands that fed the Imperium's endless hunger for sustenance. Its population of 12 million worked vast agricultural complexes that stretched across continents, their labor directed by a handful of noble houses who had governed the world for millennia. The rebellion began with a single act of defiance. Planetary Governor Hasta Vernine had increased the tithe by 30%, claiming imperial demands required greater sacrifice from his subjects. The workers, already pushed to the edge of subsistence, could not absorb the additional burden. They began to organize, to speak of rights and representation, concepts that had no place in the rigid hierarchy of imperial law. The rebellion might have been contained if Governor Vernine had shown restraint. A few public executions, some carefully applied pressure, and the dissent would have collapsed. Instead, he ordered his planetary defense forces to fire on peaceful protesters. 300 civilians died in the first massacre. Their bodies were left in the streets as a warning to others who might harbor seditious thoughts. The warning had the opposite effect. Within weeks, the rebellion had spread across 7 continents. The workers seized control of agricultural facilities, disrupted tithe shipments, and began executing imperial officials. What had started as economic protest transformed into full-scale insurrection. That was when we were called in. The situation on Gethsemane has deteriorated beyond conventional response, briefed Captain Mordaunt as our strike cruiser approached the system. Intelligence indicates possible chaos influence among the rebel leadership. Your mission is to eliminate the insurgency by any means necessary. I studied the tactical data with growing unease. The rebels numbered in the millions, supported by a significant portion of the planetary defense forces who had joined their cause. They held fortified positions across multiple continents and had demonstrated surprising tactical sophistication in their operations. This would not be a clean military action. This would be a war of extermination. Our first strike targeted the rebel command structure on Gethsemane's northern continent. We deployed via drop pod into the heart of their stronghold, a converted agricultural facility that had been transformed into a fortress. The rebels fought with desperate courage. They lacked our enhanced physiology, our power armor, our superior weapons, but they knew they were fighting for their families, their homes, their very survival. When cornered, humans can display remarkable tenacity. I led my squad through the facility's corridors, our bolters reaping a harvest of flesh and bone. The rebels had improvised weapons from agricultural equipment, chainsaws, industrial cutters, chemical sprayers filled with corrosive compounds. None of it was effective against Space Marine armor, but their willingness to die fighting gave me pause. These were not cultists corrupted by chaos. They were not Xenos invaders or heretical fanatics. They were ordinary humans, driven to rebellion by circumstances beyond their control. The thought troubled me more than I cared to admit. The facility's final stronghold was a communal shelter where the rebels had gathered their non-combatants. Women, children, elderly workers too frail to fight. Standard protocol dictated complete elimination of insurgent populations to prevent future rebellion. I stood at the entrance to the shelter, my bolter trained on the sealed doors, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: doubt. Through the door, I could hear them. Mothers singing lullabies to frightened children. Elderly voices reciting prayers to the Emperor, begging for deliverance that would not come. The soft sobbing of those who understood what waited beyond the barriers they had erected. "Brother-Sergeant," voxed Brother Matthias, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Orders?" I considered the tactical situation. The shelter contained approximately 400 non-combatants. Eliminating them would remove any possibility of future insurgency from this location. It would also send a message to other rebel strongholds about the consequences of resistance. It would be efficient, logical, strategically sound, but it would also be the murder of innocents whose only crime was existing in the path of Imperial policy. "Seal the entrances," I ordered finally. "Post guards. We'll address the non-combatants after the primary objectives are secured." It was a delaying tactic, nothing more. Eventually, the shelter would be opened and its contents processed according to standard protocols. But for now, I could postpone the decision that my enhanced mind knew was inevitable. 3 days later, the rebellion was crushed. We had eliminated 17 major strongholds, killed approximately 40,000 insurgents, and captured another 60,000 for transportation to penal colonies. The agricultural facilities were back under Imperial control, their machinery cleaned of rebel blood and prepared for resumed operation. The non-combatants in the shelter had been processed according to standard procedures. Children under the age of 10 were placed in Imperial orphanages for re-education. Adults were classified as potential security risks and transported to labor camps on distant worlds. None would ever see Gethsemane again. That night, as I stood watch over the pacified world, I found myself thinking about the sounds I had heard through the shelter doors, the lullabies and prayers, the sobs and whispered comfort, expressions of human emotion that I had been systematically conditioned to view as weakness. For the first time in decades, I wondered what I had lost in becoming what I was. Chapter 8. The Ghosts of Memory. The answer came to me on Mordian, where we had been deployed to counter an Orc war that threatened to overrun the system's industrial capacity. I had been a space marine for 73 years by then, my service record decorated with honors from campaigns across 3 sectors. I commanded a full company of battle brothers, my tactical expertise recognized even by chapter command. I was everything the transformation process was designed to create, a perfect weapon in service to the Golden Throne. But perfection, I was learning, came with unexpected complications. The Orc forces on Mordian were more organized than usual, led by a war boss whose cunning matched his brutality. The Greenskins had established a series of fortified positions across the world's primary continent, their defensive works showing unusual sophistication for Xenos constructions. Our assault required precise coordination between multiple Space Marine forces and the local Astra Militarum regiments. As company commander, I was responsible for tactical planning that would minimize Imperial casualties while maximizing enemy destruction. It was during these planning sessions that I encountered Colonel Vex Mordian, commanding officer of the local defense forces. She was, by any objective measure, an exceptional human specimen. Enhanced by Juvenat treatments and military-grade augmetics, she possessed physical capabilities that approached the lower bounds of transhuman performance. Her tactical acumen was impressive, her understanding of combined arms warfare sophisticated, her devotion to the Imperial cause absolute. She was also, I realized with growing discomfort, attractive in ways that my enhanced physiology should have rendered irrelevant. The realization struck me during our 3rd planning session, when she leaned over the tactical display to indicate enemy positions. The scent of her hair, some chemical compound designed to mask natural human pheromones, triggered responses in my modified brain that I had assumed were long dead. Space Marines were not supposed to experience sexual attraction. The chemical cascades that drove reproductive behavior in baseline humans had been suppressed by our transformation, replaced by more efficient neurological pathways focused on combat effectiveness. Yet I found myself studying the curve of her jaw, the way her eyes narrowed when processing complex data, the precise movements of her augmetic hand as she manipulated the display's controls. It was a distraction I could not afford, and one that called into question fundamental assumptions about what I had become. The campaign lasted 6 months. We broke the Orc positions through a series of coordinated strikes that demonstrated everything I had learned about warfare in 7 decades of service. My battle brothers performed with their usual mechanical precision, their enhanced abilities proving decisive in engagement after engagement. But it was the human forces under Colonel Mordian's command that impressed me most. I watched her lead her soldiers through impossible odds, their baseline physiology compensated by discipline, courage, and tactical innovation. They lacked our enhanced strength, our improved reflexes, our redundant organ systems. But they possessed something we had lost in our transformation. The desperate creativity that came from knowing death was always one mistake away. On the final day of the campaign, as we prepared to assault the war boss's fortress, Colonel Mordian approached me with a request that would haunt me for decades to come. "I want to fight beside your Marines in the final assault," she said, her augmetic eye whirring as it focused on my helm's optical systems. "My soldiers have earned the right to be there when we take the bastard down." Standard protocol dictated refusal. Baseline humans, even enhanced ones, were a liability in Space Marine operations. Their slower reflexes and inferior protection made them tactical weaknesses that could compromise mission success. But something in her expression, a combination of pride, determination, and barely controlled fury at what the Orcs had done to her world, resonated with memories I thought had been completely suppressed. I remembered a boy named Cassius who had once looked at the world with similar intensity, who had possessed dreams and ambitions beyond mere survival, who had believed, with the naive certainty of youth, that courage and determination could overcome any obstacle. That boy was dead, consumed by the transformation process decades ago, but his ghost stirred in response to Colonel Mordian's passionate plea. "Very well," I heard myself say, "your forces will take the left flank, but you follow my orders without question." Her smile in that moment was radiant. It lit up her scarred features and made her seem, despite her augmentics and military bearing, entirely human. It was the most beautiful thing I had seen in 70 years of service. Chapter 9. The Price of Humanity. The assault on the Orc fortress was a masterpiece of combined arms tactics. My battle brothers struck the primary defensive line, while Colonel Mordian's forces infiltrated through the industrial sectors. The coordination required split-second timing and absolute trust between transhuman and baseline forces. It worked perfectly until the war boss revealed his final surprise. The fortress was built around a massive industrial complex that the Orcs had been using to manufacture weapons of unusual sophistication. But beneath the factory lay something far more dangerous, a cache of Dark Age technology that the Greenskins had been attempting to reverse engineer. When the primary reactor went critical, it triggered a chain reaction that threatened to level half the continent. I had perhaps 30 seconds to reach the control systems and initiate emergency shutdown procedures. The route led through a corridor filled with superheated plasma and radiation levels that would kill even a Space Marine in minutes. Colonel Mordian was closer to the controls, but her baseline physiology would never survive the environment. The tactical solution was obvious. I would make the run, accepting the near certainty of death to prevent a catastrophe that could kill millions. It was what I had been designed for, the ultimate expression of the Space Marine ideal. But as I prepared to enter the death trap corridor, Colonel Mordian grabbed my arm with her augmetic hand. "There's another way," she said, her voice barely audible over the reactor's rising scream. "The maintenance shafts. They're shielded, but they're too small for power armor." She was right. The shafts could provide access to the control room, but only for someone of baseline human dimensions. She could reach the controls and initiate shutdown, but the radiation exposure would be fatal, even with her augmentics. "You'll die," I said, stating the obvious tactical reality. "Yes," she replied without hesitation, "but millions more will live." It was the kind of calculation I had made thousands of times during my decades of service. The mathematics were simple. One life to save millions represented an acceptable exchange rate. I should have ordered her to proceed immediately. Instead, I found myself paralyzed by an emotion I barely recognized. I didn't want her to die. The realization struck me like a bolt round to the chest. For 70 years, I had watched humans die with perfect equanimity. Soldiers under my command, civilians caught in crossfires, entire populations sacrificed for strategic advantage. All of them had been acceptable losses in service to the greater good. But the thought of watching Colonel Mordian's life burn away in that irradiated shaft filled me with something approaching anguish. "There has to be another way," I said, and heard the desperation in my own voice. She smiled at me then. Not the fierce grin of a warrior preparing for battle, but something softer, something that spoke to the dead boy whose memories still haunted my enhanced mind. "This is what humanity means," she said quietly. "Not the species, the quality, the willingness to sacrifice yourself for others, even when it's not tactical, even when it's not logical. You've forgotten that, haven't you? In becoming angels, you lost what made you men." Before I could respond, she was gone, crawling into the maintenance shaft with her augmetic tools and a portable radiation detector. I watched her disappear into the narrow passage, my enhanced hearing tracking her progress through the facility's superstructure. The radiation levels climbed steadily as she approached the control room. I could hear her vitals through the VoxLink, heart rate elevated but steady, breathing labored but controlled. She was dying by degrees, her baseline human physiology burning away under the reactor's malevolent glow. But she kept moving forward. "Control room in sight," she reported, her voice already showing signs of radiation poisoning. "Initiating shutdown sequence now." The reactor's screen began to fade as emergency protocols engaged. Coolant systems activated, control rods descended. The chain reaction that threatened to destroy half a continent slowly ground to a halt. "Shutdown successful," Colonel Mordian reported. "Reactor is stable. Mission accomplished." Then, more quietly, "Cassius, I can't see anymore. The radiation." "I'm here," I said, though she couldn't hear me through the shielding. "You did it. You saved them all." Her vitals went flat 60 seconds later. I stood in that corridor for long minutes after the silence fell, staring at the maintenance shaft that had become her tomb. Around me, my battle brothers secured the facility and processed the tactical aftermath of our victory. But all I could think about was her last words and what they revealed about the price of my transformation. Chapter 10. The Long War. The decades that followed blurred together in an endless procession of campaigns and conflicts. I fought the enemies of mankind across 100 worlds, my tactical expertise growing with each engagement. I led battle brothers through the grinding horror of trench warfare on Vrax. I commanded orbital strikes against chaos cults on the edges of the Eye of Terror. I stood in the breach when Tyranid hive fleets threatened to devour entire systems. Each campaign added new scars to my armor, new honors to my service record, new ghosts to the collection that haunted my enhanced memory. But it was the small moments that troubled me most. On Cadia, I watched a guardsman hold his dying comrade as artillery shells rained around them. The wounded man was beyond help, his injuries too severe for even advanced medical intervention. But his friends stayed with him anyway, whispering words of comfort as death approached. No Space Marine would have done the same. We would have harvested his gene seed and moved to the next tactical objective. Efficient, logical, correct. Yet I found myself envying the dying man's final moments, surrounded by genuine human emotion rather than cold military calculation. On Armageddon, I encountered a refugee family fleeing the Orc invasion. The parents carried their children through the ruins of their city, sharing their meager supplies with other survivors, despite having barely enough for themselves. Their faces showed exhaustion, terror, and something else. A stubborn hope that things could be better. I protected them, of course. Civilian evacuation was part of our operational parameters. But I also watched them with growing fascination, trying to understand the emotional bonds that drove their actions. The father who gave his food to his daughter even as he starved. The mother who sang lullabies in bombed-out shelters to keep fear at bay. These were the people I had been created to protect, but I could no longer truly comprehend what made them worth protecting. The revelation came during the Gethsemane massacre, when political expediency demanded the elimination of an entire planetary population to prevent chaos corruption from spreading. I led the assault personally, my company moving through the hab blocks with methodical precision. The civilians we encountered were not cultists or heretics. They were ordinary people whose only crime was living on a world where the warp had briefly touched reality. Standard protocol dictated complete sterilization. Every man, woman, and child eliminated to prevent potential corruption. The Ordo Hereticus had provided clear tactical guidelines for such operations, swift, thorough, without mercy or hesitation. I followed those guidelines with mechanical precision. 12 million civilians died over the course of 3 days. My battle brothers performed their duties without question, their enhanced minds focused on tactical efficiency rather than moral implications. We were weapons, and weapons do not question their wielders. But as I stood in the ruins of Genna's final city, watching smoke rise from the pyres where we had burned the dead, I realized something had broken inside me. Not my loyalty to the Emperor, that remained absolute. Not my dedication to duty, I would continue to serve until death claimed me, but something more fundamental, something connected to the human memories that I thought had been completely suppressed. I could no longer remember why any of this mattered. The Imperium we served was vast and terrible, a grinding machine that consumed lives by the billions in service to an emperor who might already be dead. The enemies we fought were often as human as those we protected, driven to desperation by the same crushing system that had created us. And we, the Space Marines, the Angels of Death, humanity's supposed salvation, had become something that could slaughter innocents with the same emotional detachment we brought to killing Xenos. What were we protecting? What were we preserving? What future were we fighting for? The questions haunted me through the long years that followed, growing stronger with each campaign, each victory, each necessary atrocity committed in the name of mankind's survival. Chapter 11. The Horus Heresy's Echo. The answer came to me during the Badab War, when Space Marines turned their weapons against each other in a conflict that echoed the ancient betrayal of Horus. I had been promoted to Chapter Master by then, my centuries of service finally recognized with ultimate authority over the Aurora chapter. I commanded 10,000 battle brothers spread across 50 worlds, each one a perfect weapon forged from human stock and transhuman ambition. The war began over tithe disputes. The Astral Claw's refusal to comply with Administratum, demands for increased tribute from their domain. It should have been resolved through negotiation, compromise, political maneuvering. Instead, it became a bloodbath that consumed 3 entire Space Marine chapters. I led my battle brothers against the Astral Claws on Badab Primaris, where their fortress monastery had become the center of a rebellion that threatened to spread across the entire sector. These were not Xenos or heretics we faced, but fellow Astartes who had made different choices about duty and loyalty. The irony was not lost on me. We were angels of death, created to protect humanity, killing other angels of death who claimed the same purpose. The siege lasted 8 months. I watched my battle brothers die in trenches carved from adamantine and ceramite. I ordered bombardments that reduced ancient monuments to rubble. I fought hand-to-hand combat with warriors whose training mirrored my own, whose dedication matched mine, whose only crime was reaching different conclusions about service and honor. Brother Captain Theron of the Astral Claws died with my chainsword through his chest. His final words, a condemnation of the system we both served. "You're killing the wrong enemies," he gasped as his dual hearts failed. "We should be fighting for humanity, not for the bureaucrats who treat us like disposable weapons." His words stayed with me long after his gene seed had been harvested and his body consigned to the flames. The war's aftermath was even more troubling than the conflict itself. The surviving astral claws were declared excommunicate traitoris, their names struck from Imperial records. Their homeworld was subjected to exterminatus, its population of 4 billion souls sacrificed to ensure no trace of their heresy survived. I stood on the bridge of my battle barge as the cyclonic torpedoes fell, watching an entire world burn because its defenders had dared to question Imperial authority. Children who had never heard of the astral claws died screaming in nuclear fire. Artists, scholars, workers, farmers, all of them reduced to ash because proximity to rebellion was deemed sufficient cause for annihilation. That night, alone in my sanctum, I did something I hadn't done since my transformation began. I wept. The tears came slowly at first, forced from enhanced tear ducts that had been designed more for battlefield utility than emotional expression. But once they started, I couldn't stop them. Centuries of suppressed grief poured out of me, for the boy I had been, for the humans I had failed to protect, for the innocents I had killed in service to a system that seemed to create more suffering than it prevented. I wept for Colonel Mordian, who had shown me what humanity meant before dying in service to others. I wept for the civilians of Genna, whose only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time. I wept for Brother Captain Theron, whose rebellion might have been more justified than my loyalty. Most of all, I wept for what I had become, a weapon so perfectly crafted that I had forgotten what I was supposed to be fighting for. Chapter 12. The Weight of Command. The centuries that followed taught me the final, most bitter truth about being a space marine. We are not humanity's salvation, but its tragic necessity. I led the Aurora chapter through the grinding horror of the 13th Black Crusade, where chaos forces poured from the Eye of Terror in numbers that defied comprehension. I watched entire systems burn as the Imperium's defenses crumbled before the onslaught of demons and traitor marines. The scale of destruction was incomprehensible to baseline human minds. Entire sectors, hundreds of star systems containing billions of souls, were consumed in the space of months. The very fabric of reality tore and bled as the warp spilled into real space, transforming once peaceful worlds into nightmare landscapes where the laws of physics held no meaning. On Belisar 4, I witnessed a chaos incursion that turned the planet's oceans into liquid fire. The screams of the dying population could be heard across the void, their anguish somehow transcending the vacuum of space to reach our ship's sensors as psychic emanations. My battle brothers processed this information as tactical data, casualty reports, resource losses, strategic implications. I found myself mourning 12 billion souls I had never met. The realization troubled me more than I could express through the limited emotional vocabulary that remained to me after centuries of conditioning. These were not abstract numbers in a tactical readout, but individual lives cut short by forces beyond their comprehension. Children who would never grow to adulthood. Artists whose works would never be completed. Lovers separated by death before they could speak their final words. Each loss represented not just a casualty statistic, but the ending of a unique perspective, an irreplaceable way of seeing and understanding the universe. The chaos forces that consumed these worlds were not merely destroying infrastructure or eliminating military assets. They were burning away fragments of humanity's collective soul. My battle brothers could not comprehend this distinction. To them, 12 billion dead humans were significant only insofar as they represented lost production capacity, reduced tithe generation, eliminated recruitment potential. The individual tragedies that comprised that larger number were beyond their enhanced but narrowed perception. On Cadia, that fortress world that had stood against chaos for 10,000 years, I fought beside guardsmen who knew they were going to die but held the line anyway. I saw teenagers from agri-worlds stand against the abhuman horrors of the warp, their laser guns pathetic against enemies that laughed at conventional weapons. The defense of Cadia was a study in contrasts that illuminated everything I had come to understand about the gulf between transhuman and baseline human experience. My space marines fought with mechanical precision. Their enhanced physiology and superior equipment making them devastatingly effective against chaos forces. They processed battlefield data with inhuman speed, coordinated their actions with perfect timing, and adapted to changing tactical situations faster than any baseline commander could follow. But the guardsmen fought with something my battle brothers lacked: desperate courage born of mortal stakes. I watched a young soldier named Corvus hold a forward position against a demon incursion for 3 hours after his squad was killed. His lasgun had run out of power cells, his armor was breached in 7 places, and blood loss should have rendered him unconscious. But he kept fighting with a bayonet and improvised explosives because falling back would expose a civilian evacuation route. When reinforcements finally reached his position, they found him still standing over the bodies of 17 lesser demons, his face twisted in a rictus of defiance even in death. The medics estimated he had been fighting for the final hour with wounds that should have killed him in minutes. No Space Marine would have made that choice. We would have conducted a tactical withdrawal to preserve our combat effectiveness for future engagements. The mathematics of the situation were clear. One soldier's life was insignificant compared to the strategic value of veteran Astartes' assets. But Corvus had not been thinking strategically. He had been thinking about the family sheltering behind his position, the children who would die if the demons broke through, the mothers and fathers and grandparents whose only protection was a half-dead guardsman with a bayonet. He had chosen to die for people he would never meet, whose names he would never know, whose gratitude he would never receive. That was humanity. Not the species, but the quality, the capacity for irrational sacrifice in service of abstract ideals like justice, mercy, love. On Macon Prime, I observed a refugee camp where displaced populations from 17 different worlds had been temporarily housed while Imperial authorities decided their ultimate fate. The conditions were appalling by any objective measure: insufficient food, inadequate shelter, minimal medical care. Disease ran rampant through the overcrowded shelters. Violence between different cultural groups erupted regularly. Yet within that nightmare, I witnessed acts of compassion that defied explanation. A woman from Vaxhall shared her family's meager rations with orphaned children from Mordian. An elderly scholar from Talon taught reading to illiterate workers from Armageddon. A former gang leader from Necromunda organized the younger refugees into work details that maintained the camp's infrastructure, turning potential destructive energy into constructive purpose. None of these actions made tactical sense. The resources were insufficient for everyone. Sharing them only ensured that more people would suffer from malnutrition. The time spent on education could have been used for more practical survival activities. The gang leader gained no benefit from organizing others, only additional responsibility and risk. But they did it anyway, because some part of them recognized that survival without dignity, existence without hope, life without compassion was not worth preserving. My apothecary, Brother-Sergeant Valerius, observed these activities with clinical detachment. Inefficient resource allocation, he noted in his daily reports. Emotional decision-making, compromising survival optimization. He was correct from a purely logical standpoint. But I began to suspect that pure logic was itself a kind of blindness, a form of intellectual myopia that could calculate the cost of everything but understand the value of nothing. The revelation deepened during the siege of Kasapatox, Cadia's primary fortress city. For 6 months, we held the walls against waves of traitor marines, demon engines, and cultist hordes that seemed to emerge from the very ground itself. The siege wore down defenders and attackers alike, grinding both sides through a meat grinder of constant combat that consumed lives with industrial efficiency. My battle brothers endured the siege with their usual mechanical persistence. They maintained their equipment, followed their tactical protocols, and eliminated targets with methodical precision. When wounded, they reported to the apothecaries for repair. When their ammunition ran low, they requisitioned additional supplies through proper channels. When ordered to hold a position, they held it until relieved or killed. They were perfect weapons, functioning exactly as designed. But the human defenders showed me something more complex and ultimately more valuable: the capacity for growth under pressure. I watched Commissar Valdez evolve from a rigid disciplinarian into something approaching a father figure for his troops. Initially, he had maintained order through fear and summary execution of those who showed signs of weakness. But as the siege progressed, he began to understand that fear alone was insufficient motivation for the kind of sustained heroism the situation demanded. He started remembering his soldiers' names. He began sharing their rations during the worst shortages. When a young guardsman broke down crying after watching his best friend die, Valdez held him instead of shooting him for cowardice. "They need to know someone cares whether they live or die," he explained to me during a brief respite between assaults. "Not just whether they complete their missions, but whether they as individuals matter to someone." It was an insight that would have been literally incomprehensible to my battle brothers. We were conditioned to view individual identity as a weakness to be overcome, personal attachments as tactical liabilities. The idea that caring about subordinates as people rather than assets could improve their performance contradicted everything we had been taught about command dynamics, but the results were undeniable. Valdez's troops fought with increasing effectiveness as the siege progressed, their tactical coordination improving as their emotional bonds strengthened. They began anticipating each other's needs, covering each other's weaknesses, supporting each other through psychological crises that would have broken less cohesive units. They became more than the sum of their parts through love rather than enhancement. The contrast with my own forces was stark. My battle brothers maintained their individual effectiveness throughout the siege, but they never developed the kind of intuitive cooperation that characterized the human defenders. They worked together efficiently, but they did not truly connect. When Brother Matthias fell to a demon prince's plague blade, the rest of his squad processed his loss as a reduction in firepower rather than a personal tragedy. They harvested his gene seed, redistributed his equipment, and continued their mission without missing a tactical beat. When Guardsman Corvus died holding his position, his surviving squad mates wept for him. Then they named their next objective in his honor and fought twice as hard to take it. Which response better served humanity's long-term interests? They died in their millions, but they held. Not because they were enhanced or augmented or transformed into weapons of war, but because they chose to fight for something larger than themselves. The final assault on Casa Partox came after a warp storm temporarily disrupted Chaos reinforcements. Abaddon himself led the attack, his Talon of Horus crackling with energies that could unmake reality itself. Behind him marched the Black Legion's finest, their black armor inscribed with blasphemies that hurt to perceive. We met them on the fortress walls, angels of death against traitor marines, transhuman against transhuman in a battle that would determine the fate of the entire sector. The combat was everything Space Marine warfare was designed to be: precise, lethal, conducted at speeds that would blur together in baseline human perception. Bolter rounds detonated against ceramite plate, power weapons carved through enhanced flesh. Tactical geniuses implemented strategies that unfolded across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But in the end, the battle was decided not by transhuman skill, but by human sacrifice. A young guardsman, I never learned his name, managed to reach the fortress's main ammunition depot while the Space Marine battle raged around him. The structure had been damaged by artillery fire, its containment systems compromised. One more direct hit from Chaos forces would detonate the entire stockpile, likely collapsing the wall and giving Abaddon the breach he needed. The guardsman could have evacuated with the other human defenders. He could have reported the vulnerability through proper channels and let others decide how to address it. He could have prioritized his own survival as any rational being would. Instead, he triggered the detonation manually. The explosion vaporized 3 city blocks and killed everyone within a kilometer radius: Chaos Marines, Imperial defenders, and the guardsman himself. But it also sealed the breach, prevented the wall from falling, and bought us the time we needed to organize a counterattack. One baseline human, acting on his own initiative, without orders or support or hope of survival, had changed the course of the battle. As I stood in the crater where he had died, looking at the fused glass that was all that remained of his sacrifice, I finally understood the question that had been haunting me for centuries. What were we fighting for? We were fighting for the right of humans to make those kinds of choices. The right to choose sacrifice over safety, others over self, hope over despair. The right to be irrationally heroic in a universe that rewarded only cold calculation. My battle brothers could not make such choices because choice required the capacity for moral conflict, and moral conflict had been conditioned out of us. We could follow protocols, implement strategies, execute orders with perfect precision. But we could not choose to be heroes because heroism required the possibility of cowardice. The guardsman had been afraid. I could see it in the thermal patterns his body had left on the recording systems. He had wanted to live, wanted to see his family again, wanted to experience the simple pleasures that made life worth living. He had chosen duty anyway, not because conditioning demanded it, but because love required it. I began to understand then what Colonel Mordian had tried to tell me in those final moments on Gethsemane. Humanity wasn't a species to be protected. It was a quality to be preserved. The willingness to sacrifice, to hope, to love even in the face of overwhelming darkness. And we, the Space Marines, had traded away that quality for the power to protect what remained. The Primaris reinforcements that arrived after Guilliman's return only confirmed what I had begun to suspect. These new Marines were even more perfect than we had been, their enhancements more advanced, their conditioning more complete. They were superior weapons in every measurable way. They were also even further removed from the human experience they were created to defend. I watched a Primaris sergeant execute a wounded civilian because treating his injuries would have delayed their tactical advance by 30 minutes. The decision was logically sound, tactically correct, strategically justified. It was also the kind of choice that would have horrified the boy I had once been, before the transformation burned away everything weak and merely human. During the mop-up operations after Cadia's evacuation, I had the opportunity to observe the Primaris Marines in extended combat operations. Their performance was flawless by any objective measure. Faster reflexes, improved coordination, enhanced tactical processing capabilities. They moved through combat environments like living weapons, each motion calculated for maximum efficiency. But they lacked something essential that even my generation of Space Marines had retained: the ghost of human instinct. When faced with tactical decisions that required choosing between military objectives and civilian casualties, the Primaris consistently chose the objectives. When presented with prisoners who might provide intelligence but would consume resources to maintain, they eliminated them without hesitation. When ordered to hold positions that required superhuman endurance, they held them until death, never questioning whether the sacrifice was proportionate to the strategic gain. They were perfect soldiers, but they were no longer capable of the kind of moral flexibility that warfare sometimes demanded. I witnessed this during the liberation of Mordak's hive, where Chaos cultists had taken civilian hostages to prevent orbital bombardment of their positions. The tactical solution was straightforward: acceptable losses among the hostage population to eliminate a strategic threat. Brother-Sergeant Titus, one of the Primaris reinforcements, implemented this solution without consultation or hesitation. His forces breached the cultist stronghold with precisely calculated explosive charges that eliminated the threats, while minimizing civilian casualties. 14,000 hostages died in the assault. The cultists were eliminated with 99.7% efficiency. But among the hostages were children from the local Schola Progenium, future servants of the Imperium who represented decades of investment in training and conditioning. There were also skilled tech priests whose knowledge of forbidden technologies could have proven invaluable in future operations. Most significantly, there were ordinary families whose deaths served no strategic purpose beyond demonstrating Imperial ruthlessness. My generation of Space Marines might have found a different solution, not because we were more skilled, but because we retained enough vestigial humanity to recognize the value of what would be lost. We might have risked tactical disadvantage to preserve something intangible but important. The Primaris could not make such calculations because they had been designed to view all non-military considerations as inefficiency to be eliminated. They were becoming something that could win any battle but lose the war for humanity's soul. As I observed their operations over the following months, I began to catalogue the subtle but significant differences between enhanced humans and post-human weapons. The original Space Marines had been created from human stock, their personalities built upon foundations of childhood experience, emotional development, social bonding. The enhancement process had suppressed these elements, but traces remained. Ghosts in the machine that occasionally influenced decision-making in ways that pure logic could not explain. The Primaris had been created through more advanced techniques that eliminated such inefficiencies. They emerged from their vats already mature, already conditioned, already optimized for warfare. They had no childhood memories to suppress, no emotional attachments to overcome, no irrational human impulses to constrain. They were born weapons, and they would die weapons, never having experienced the transformation from human to transhuman that defined my generation's identity. In a sense, they had never fallen from grace because they had never possessed grace to begin with. The implications of this distinction would haunt me for years to come. As I began to understand that the Imperium was not just losing its humanity through external threats, but through its own efforts to create perfect defenders. Each generation of enhancement moved further from the qualities that made humanity worth defending, until eventually the Guardians would be indistinguishable from the threats they opposed. We were winning the war against chaos by becoming what chaos had always claimed we were: soulless weapons in service to a dead god, preserving the form of civilization while destroying its substance. The boy from Metalica, who had once dreamed of being a hero, would have been horrified by what his dreams had wrought. But that boy was dead, consumed by the very process that had given me the power to recognize the tragedy of his loss. This was the weight of command, understanding not just what orders to give, but what those orders cost the people who carried them out, and what they preserved for the people they were meant to protect. I was beginning to suspect that the price was becoming higher than the value of what we purchased with it. Chapter 13. The last choice, my final deployment, came during the Plague Wars, when Nurgle's forces threatened to transform the Ultramar sector into a garden of decay and corruption. I was old by then. Nearly 400 years of service had left their mark even on my enhanced physiology. My original organs were failing, kept functional only by constant medical intervention. My armor had been repaired and modified so many times that little of the original remained. But my mind remained sharp, my tactical expertise undiminished by age. I commanded the Aurora chapter's contribution to the defense of Eax, where Mortarion himself led the Death Guard against Guilliman's forces. It was there that I encountered something that changed my understanding of everything I had become. In the ruins of Ajax's capital city, my battle brothers and I discovered a medical facility where Imperial scientists had been conducting research into the plague weapons deployed by Nurgle's forces. The work was necessary. Without understanding the enemy's capabilities, we could not develop effective countermeasures. But the research subjects were human civilians, captured during the Death Guard's advance and subjected to deliberate infection for study purposes. I found them in containment cells, their bodies ravaged by diseases that defied description. Men, women, children, all of them, slowly dying as Imperial scientists documented the progression of their suffering for the greater good. "The data we've gathered here is invaluable," explained Magos biologist Koran as he led me through the facility. "These subjects have provided insights into Nurgle's corruption that could save millions of lives." I studied the test subjects through reinforced glass, my enhanced senses cataloguing their symptoms with clinical precision. A woman clutching a child whose flesh was slowly rotting away, an elderly man whose organs were visible through translucent skin, a teenager whose screams had been surgically silenced to prevent disruption of nearby experiments. Standard protocol supported the research. The sacrifice of hundreds to save millions represented an acceptable exchange rate. The subjects were going to die anyway. At least their suffering served a purpose. But as I watched the woman comfort her dying child, singing a lullaby in a language I didn't recognize, I saw something that my enhanced mind had been conditioned to ignore: the divine spark that made them human despite their suffering. "Terminate the experiments," I ordered. Magos Koran's augmetic eyes focused on me with mechanical precision. "Chapter Master, the research is at a critical juncture. Terminating now would waste invaluable data. I said, terminate the experiments. I cannot comply with that order. The data these subjects provide is too valuable to the war effort. I drew my bolt pistol and put a round through his primary cogitator. As his augmented form collapsed, I turned to address the facility's staff. Anyone who wishes to continue the research can join him, I announced. Otherwise, begin euthanizing the subjects. Give them whatever peace we can. The next hour was spent in acts of mercy that violated every tactical doctrine I had learned in 4 centuries of service. We ended the suffering of those too far gone to save, provided medical care for those who might recover, and arranged transport to safe zones for the survivors. It was inefficient. It was strategically questionable. It diverted resources from our primary mission. It was also the most human thing I had done since my transformation began. Chapter 14, The Return. The journey back to Aurora began with a single question. What did it mean to serve humanity if you could no longer remember what humanity was? I had commanded 10,000 space marines, conquered 100 worlds, served the Golden Throne for 4 centuries. I was a chapter master, a hero of the Imperium, a legend whose name would be remembered long after my death. I was also a weapon that had forgotten its purpose. The revelation came to me during the long transit through the warp. As I stood vigil in the ship's chapel before the shrine to the Emperor, the statue looked down at me with stone eyes, its face carved with the perfect features of a god made manifest. But I found myself remembering a different face, Colonel Mordian's smile in those final moments, before she crawled into the irradiated shaft. The expression of someone choosing to sacrifice herself, not because tactics demanded it, but because love required it. That was what we had lost in our transformation. Not just our humanity, but our capacity for the irrational choices that made humanity worth saving. We had become perfect weapons, but perfect weapons could not understand why the war was worth fighting. The solution, when it came to me, was as simple as it was heretical. I began to reverse the conditioning. It took years of careful work, using techniques developed by apothecaries for treating battlefield trauma. I slowly began to unlock the suppressed memories, to reconnect with the emotional pathways that had been severed during my transformation. The process was agonizing. Each recovered memory brought with it the full weight of emotions I had been conditioned to ignore. I remembered my mother's face when the apothecaries came for me, and felt the grief I should have experienced as a child. I recalled the first humans I had killed during the trials, and experienced the horror that should have accompanied those acts. But I also remembered why those emotions mattered. I began to share my discoveries with selected battle brothers, those whose service records showed signs of the same doubts that had plagued me. Not all were receptive. Many had been too thoroughly conditioned to question their nature, but some listened, and in listening began their own journey back towards something approaching humanity. It was dangerous work. If discovered by the chaplains or reported to chapter command, it would be classified as corruption, requiring immediate purging. We walked a knife's edge between redemption and damnation, trying to recover what we had lost without losing what we had become. Chapter 15, The New Understanding. The final revelation came during the Battle of Baal, when the Tyrannid High Fleet Leviathan threatened to devour the Blood Angels' homeworld. I led the Aurora chapter's contribution to the defense. Our forces integrated with multiple other chapters in a desperate attempt to break the swarm before it could establish a foothold on the planet's surface. The fighting was brutal even by space, marine standards, endless waves of bioforms crashing against defensive lines that grew thinner with each assault. Baal represented something unique in the galaxy, world where one of the original legions had maintained their culture for 10,000 years. Unlike many chapter homeworlds that had become sterile fortress monasteries, Baal retained the wild beauty and savage nobility that had shaped Sanguinius and his sons. The approach to the system revealed the scope of what we faced. High Fleet Leviathan stretched across light years of space, its bioships forming patterns that resembled some vast organism, reaching hungry tendrils toward its prey. Our combined fleets, Aurora, Blood Angels, Flesh Tearers, and dozens of successor chapters, appeared insignificant against the organic tide that had already consumed 17 systems on its path to Baal. But it was the human defenders that taught me the final lesson about what we were meant to be. The planetary militia consisted of ordinary men and women armed with basic equipment and minimal training. They had no enhanced physiology, no power armor, no centuries of combat experience. By every tactical measure, they were useless in a battle of this magnitude. Commander Helena Voss led the largest contingent of militia forces, 30,000 volunteers, drawn from Baal's radiation-scarred population. Her forces included PDF troopers with decades of service, factory workers who had never held weapons before the invasion, even children barely old enough to carry ammunition. During our initial briefings, I observed her with the clinical interest I had learned to apply to all human allies. She was competent, experienced, realistic about her force's limitations. Her tactical assessments were sound, her logistical planning thorough, her communication with Space Marine Command appropriately deferential. But it was her interaction with her own troops that revealed something I had been too blind to see for 4 centuries. As she moved through their encampments, she knew them not as tactical assets, but as individuals. Sergeant Corvus, whose family had died in the first Tyrannid landings, but who continued fighting because someone had to. Corporal Marina, barely 18 years old, who had volunteered despite having no military training because her brother was trapped in one of the besieged cities. Private Valdez, a former hive-ganger whose criminal record had been expunged in exchange for military service. She knew their names, their stories, their fears, their hopes. More importantly, she knew that knowing these things made her a better commander, not a weaker one. They fight harder when they know you see them as people rather than equipment, she explained when I questioned the tactical efficiency of such personal involvement. Fear can motivate for a while, but it eventually breaks down. Love endures. The concept should have been foreign to me. Space Marine doctrine emphasized the dangers of personal attachment, the way emotional bonds could compromise tactical decision-making. But I found myself remembering the reconditioning work I had been doing, the recovered humanity that had shown me the value of irrational choices. Yet they fought with a courage that shamed my transhuman warriors. The first major assault came at dawn on the 3rd day of the siege. Tyrannid bioships released millions of organisms into Baal's atmosphere, their forms darkening the sky like a living storm. Gargoyles, hormagaunts, termagants, the smaller bioforms that served as the Hive Fleet's advance wave, designed to overwhelm defenses through sheer numbers. My battle brothers took their positions with mechanical precision, their bolters and heavy weapons creating overlapping fields of fire calculated to achieve maximum enemy elimination. Each shot was placed with transhuman accuracy, each tactical decision optimized for resource efficiency. But it was the militia that showed me what courage truly meant. I watched a maintenance worker, a man whose only weapon was a combat shotgun and whose only armor was industrial coveralls, hold a corridor against a swarm of hormagaunts while wounded civilians evacuated behind him. He died with empty chambers and alien claws through his chest, but he bought them the time they needed to reach safety. His name was Joachim Kalles. He had worked in the facility's atmospheric processing plant for 23 years. His wife had died in childbirth 2 decades earlier, and he had raised their daughter alone while maintaining the systems that kept thousands of others breathing. When the Tyrannids landed, he could have evacuated with the other civilians. Instead, he had volunteered for combat duty because he understood that someone had to stand between the swarm and the people he had spent his life protecting. The tactical value of his sacrifice was minimal. One man with a shotgun could not significantly impact the strategic balance of the battle. But watching him die, seeing the determination in his eyes as alien claws tore through his body, I understood something that 4 centuries of enhancement had obscured. He was not fighting because conditioning compelled him. He was not following orders because obedience had been programmed into his neural pathways. He was choosing in each moment to value the lives of others above his own survival. That was what made him human. Not his biological limitations, not his tactical inadequacies, not his emotional vulnerabilities, but his capacity to make moral choices that transcended self-interest. I saw a medical technician run into the open under enemy fire to reach a wounded guardsman, dragging him to safety despite knowing that both of them would probably die in the attempt. She took a spine round through the lung but kept moving, her baseline human determination overcoming injuries that should have been incapacitating. Dr. Sarah Chen had been a civilian physician before the invasion. Her practice focused on treating radiation sickness among Baal's population. She had no military training, no combat experience, no enhancement that would help her survive in a war zone. When the medical corps called for volunteers, she could have remained in the secure bunkers treating wounded who were brought to her. Instead, she had insisted on forward deployment, arguing that field medics could save lives that would be lost during evacuation. I watched her work for hours, moving between wounded soldiers with methodical efficiency, her baseline human hands performing surgeries that saved lives. My enhanced capabilities might have written off as tactical losses when she finally fell, a tyrannid bioweapon eating through her protective gear. Her last act was to inject a wounded guardsman with pain suppressors she had been saving for her own potential injuries. She died knowing that her choice had meaning beyond tactical calculations. Most remarkably, I witnessed a group of civilian volunteers launch a suicide attack against a carnifex that was threatening to break our defensive line. They had improvised explosives and no hope of survival, but they charged anyway because someone had to slow the creature down. The attack was led by Marcus Deathwind, a former gang leader from Baal Secundus whose criminal record included murder, extortion, and trafficking in illegal weaponry. Under normal circumstances, he would have been executed or mind-wiped for his crimes. Instead, the invasion had given him an opportunity for something approaching redemption. "I ain't asking for forgiveness," he told Commander Voss before the assault began. "Done too much bad to ever balance the scales, but maybe I can tip them a little before I go." His improvised squad consisted of other criminals, outcasts, and broken individuals who had found purpose in the face of extinction. They moved against the Carnifex with the same tactical awareness they had once applied to gang warfare, using their knowledge of violence and desperation to achieve what trained soldiers might have attempted through conventional means. The explosion that killed the bio-creature also vaporized Marcus and his entire team, but their sacrifice created a gap in the tyrannid, advance that allowed my battle brothers to reposition and establish a new defensive perimeter. These were not enhanced warriors or genetically modified superhumans. They were ordinary people making extraordinary choices, sacrificing themselves not because conditioning demanded it, but because love compelled it. And in that moment, I finally understood what we were meant to be. We were not humanity's replacement. We were their guardians, not their superiors, but their champions. Our enhancement was not meant to elevate us above human concerns, but to enable us to protect what was most precious about humanity: their capacity for choice, for sacrifice, for irrational love in the face of rational despair. The realization struck me with the force of a revelation as I watched Marcus Deathwind's final moments. Here was a man whose life had been defined by selfishness, violence, and exploitation of others' weaknesses. By every measure that Space Marine doctrine used to evaluate human worth, he was worthless, a criminal whose removal from society would improve rather than diminish its function. But in his final choice, he had demonstrated the quality that made humanity worthy of protection, not inherent goodness. His past crimes proved he was capable of terrible evil, not tactical value. His skills were more suited to destruction than construction, but the capacity for transformation, for choosing to become something better than what he had been. That capacity existed in every human, from the most noble saint to the most depraved criminal. It was what differentiated them from the bioweapons that attacked Baal, from the demons that served chaos, from the cold mechanical logic that had come to define Space Marine decision-making. My battle brothers could not make such transformative choices because transformation required the possibility of failure, and failure had been conditioned out of us. We could execute orders with perfect precision, but we could not choose to become something other than what we had been designed to be. The Space Marine who killed his brother because the Codex demanded it was a broken weapon. The Space Marine who chose to save civilians despite tactical disadvantage was functioning correctly. We had been designed not to replace humanity's virtues, but to preserve the conditions in which those virtues could flourish. This understanding changed everything. About how I approached the battle. Instead of viewing the human defenders as tactical assets to be preserved or expended based on strategic calculations, I began to see them as the reason the battle mattered in the first place. When Commander Voss requested Space Marine support for an evacuation operation that would require significant tactical risk, I approved it immediately. When Dr. Chen asked for medical supplies that could have been reserved for Space Marine casualties, I ordered them delivered without hesitation. When Marcus Deathwind proposed his suicide mission, I provided the explosives he needed and honored his sacrifice with a moment of genuine grief. My battle brothers noticed the changes in my command style. Some adapted readily, their own reconditioning allowing them to understand the deeper purposes behind apparently inefficient tactical decisions. Others struggled with orders that seemed to prioritize human concerns over strategic optimization. Brother Captain Aurelius approached me during a brief lull in the fighting. His helmet retracted to reveal an expression of carefully controlled confusion. "Chapter Master," he said, "your recent tactical decisions have been unconventional. The resource allocation for civilian protection exceeds standard parameters. The risk-benefit analysis for some operations appears to prioritize non-military objectives. Explain your concerns, Brother Captain. I do not question your authority," he said quickly, "but I seek to understand the strategic logic behind choices that appear to contradict our training." It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. How could I explain to a warrior trained for perfect logical consistency that some decisions transcended logic? How could I communicate the value of choices that serve no tactical purpose? "Tell me, Aurelius," I said, "what are we fighting for? To protect humanity from the Tyranid threat? To preserve the Imperium's territorial integrity? To serve the Emperor's will? And what is humanity?" He paused, processing implications that extended beyond standard tactical parameters. "The species we are sworn to protect," he replied carefully. "The civilian populations, the industrial capacity, the cultural inheritance that defines human civilization. But what makes them worth protecting? What quality do they possess that justifies our existence?" The question pushed against fundamental assumptions about our purpose and identity. We had been created to serve humanity, but our training had focused on the mechanics of that service rather than its meaning. "Their potential," he said slowly. "Their capacity for growth, for achievement, for contributing to the Imperium's strength." "Partially correct," I agreed, "but incomplete. Watch." I directed his attention to a nearby aid station where Dr. Chen was treating wounded civilians. Despite her own injuries, despite the tactical inefficiency of expending medical resources on non-combatants, despite the constant threat of renewed Tyranid assault, she continued her work with methodical dedication. "Observe her choices," I instructed. "Analyze the tactical logic behind her actions." Aurelius studied the scene with enhanced visual systems that could track micro-expressions, measure vital signs, analyze behavioral patterns with superhuman precision. "She is operating beyond optimal efficiency," he reported. "Her injury reduces her effectiveness by approximately 30%. The time spent on non-essential patients could be allocated to combatants with higher survival probability. The emotional energy devoted to comfort-providing behaviors serves no medical function." "Correct tactical assessment," I agreed. "Now tell me why she continues anyway." The question required him to consider motivations that existed outside his enhancement-focused worldview. For several minutes, he watched Dr. Chen work, his enhanced mind struggling to process behavior that defied logical explanation. "She chooses to act in ways that contradict optimal resource allocation," he said finally. "The behavior appears to be driven by emotional responses rather than strategic necessity." "And what does that tell you about her value as a human being? That she is—" He paused, searching for concepts that his training had not provided vocabulary to express. "That she possesses qualities we were not designed to replicate." "Precisely. She makes choices that serve no tactical purpose beyond expressing her essential nature as a moral being. She chooses compassion over efficiency, hope over despair, love over calculation. That capacity for irrational goodness is what makes humanity worth preserving." Understanding dawned in his enhanced features, and we cannot make such choices because our conditioning eliminates the emotional foundations they require. "We were taught that elimination was perfection," I said. "But what if it was actually diminishment? What if the qualities we lost were more valuable than the capabilities we gained?" The conversation continued as the battle raged around us. Slowly, carefully, I began to share with him the insights I had gained through my reconditioning work. The recovered memories, the emotional integration, the possibility that we could retain our transhuman abilities while recovering our human hearts. By the time the final Tyranid assault began, Aurelius had begun his own journey toward recovered humanity. The battle's climax came when a Hierophant Bio-Titan breached our primary defensive line, its massive form threatening to collapse the entire eastern sector. Standard tactical doctrine called for orbital bombardment, but civilian evacuation was incomplete. Thousands of non-combatants would die in the bombardment, including the wounded Dr. Chen was still treating. My old conditioning would have ordered the strike without hesitation. Acceptable losses in service to strategic necessity, the needs of the many outweighing the needs of the few. But I had remembered what it meant to choose. Instead of calling for bombardment, I led a direct assault against the Bio-Titan, my battle brothers following without question despite the tactical insanity of the maneuver. We had no weapons capable of penetrating its bio-armor, no support that could match its firepower, no backup if the assault failed. We attacked anyway, because the alternative was accepting that human lives were expendable when expediency demanded it. The assault lasted 17 minutes. We lost 12 battle brothers, their gene seed harvested even as they died, but we brought down the Bio-Titan through precisely the kind of irrational heroism that had been conditioned out of us. Choosing sacrifice over survival, meaning over efficiency, love over logic. As the creature's massive form crashed to the ground, I felt something I had never experienced after a successful mission. Not just satisfaction at a tactical objective achieved, but joy at a moral choice vindicated. We had fought like humans rather than weapons, and in doing so had become something greater than either. The Tyrannid retreat began 6 hours later, their bioships withdrawing to digest their losses and prepare for the next assault. Baal was saved, at least temporarily, but the cost had been enormous. Thousands of Space Marines dead, millions of human defenders lost, infrastructure devastated across 3 continents. By conventional measures, it had been a Pyrrhic victory at best. But as I walked among the survivors, Space Marines and humans working together to tend the wounded, share supplies, rebuild defensive positions, I understood that we had won something more valuable than tactical advantage. We had preserved the qualities that made the fight worth fighting. Commander Voss approached me as we organized the evacuation of wounded civilians. Her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had pushed human endurance to its absolute limits, but her eyes held something that had been missing from Space Marine operations for too long. Hope. "Chapter Master," she said, "I wanted to thank you, not just for the tactical support, but for seeing us, for treating us like people worth saving rather than assets to be preserved." I should have deflected her gratitude with standard responses about duty and service. Instead, I found myself speaking from the recovered humanity that reconditioning had revealed. "You showed me what we were created to protect," I said. "Not human lives, but human dignity. Not the species, but the qualities that make the species worth preserving." She smiled then. The first genuine smile I had seen on a battlefield in 4 centuries of service. "Maybe that's what angels really are," she said, echoing the words I had heard from other civilians during our campaigns. Not perfect beings who never fall, but broken ones who remember how to rise. As I prepared to depart Baal, returning to Aurora with new understanding of what it meant to serve humanity, I carried with me the memory of her smile and the words that would reshape everything I thought I knew about being a Space Marine. We were not humanity's salvation or its replacement. We were its guardians, created not to transcend human limitations, but to preserve the space in which human virtues could flourish. The boy from Metalica had died during my transformation, but something of his essence had survived. The capacity to choose love over efficiency, hope over despair, meaning over mere survival. That capacity, I now understood, was not weakness to be overcome, but strength to be recovered. The journey back to humanity had begun not with abandoning what I had become, but with remembering why I had been created in the first place. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that remembering might be the only light left to guide us home. Epilogue. The confession complete. And so I returned to where I began, standing over the body of Brother Marius, my chainsword still humming with the life it has just taken. The chaplain approaches, his skull helm reflecting the chamber's harsh lighting. "You have proven your dedication to the Codex," he intones. "The corruption has been purged, but he is wrong. The corruption was not in Marius. It was in the system that demanded his death for questioning orders that served no purpose beyond institutional control. The corruption is in the doctrine that values obedience over justice, efficiency over mercy, tactical success over moral truth." I am Cassius Dorn, Chapter Master of the Aurora Space Marines. I have served the Emperor for 407 years. I have conquered worlds, slaughtered Xenos, purged heretics, and committed acts that would be considered atrocities if performed by any force other than the Adeptus Astartes. But I have also remembered what it means to choose, to sacrifice not because conditioning demands it, but because love requires it. To protect not just human lives, but human dignity, human hope, human capacity for goodness in a galaxy that seems designed to crush such fragile things. This is the brutal truth of being a space marine. We are weapons designed to preserve what our very creation destroys. We are guardians who can no longer fully comprehend what we guard. We are angels who have forgotten how to distinguish between justice and expedience. Some of us can find our way back to something approaching humanity. Others are lost forever, trapped in the perfection of their conditioning. But all of us carry the responsibility of choice, the most human trait of all, and the one our transformation was meant to preserve rather than eliminate. The boy who was taken from Metalica died long ago, consumed by gene seed and hypno-indoctrination and the grinding necessities of war. But something of his essence remains, buried beneath layers of enhancement and conditioning, waiting to be remembered. That is the hope I offer to those who come after, that we are not completely lost, that the humanity we were created to protect still exists within us, that the choice between what is tactically correct and what is morally right remains ours to make. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war, that choice may be the only light humanity has left. Choose carefully, choose consciously, choose with full knowledge of what you sacrifice and what you preserve. Choose like a human, even if you are no longer entirely one. This is my confession. This is my warning. This is my hope for what we might yet become. Remember us not as the weapons we were made to be, but as the guardians we chose to remain, in the Emperor's name and for humanity's sake.